Taiwan, Islands of Destiny by Edwina Longbottom. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. Captain Sarah Owens adjusted her helmet as she sat in the cockpit of her F-35 Lightning II, the roar of the engine a steady comfort against the tension in her chest. Below her, the vast Pacific stretched to the horizon, a serene blue canvas disguising the storm brewing beneath its surface. The sharp, metallic tang of recycled cockpit air filled her lungs as she glanced at her squadron's formation, reflected in the multifunction displays. They were high above the Pacific, part of a task force stationed in Guam, waiting for the inevitable escalation in the Taiwan Strait. The urgency in their mission briefing replayed in her mind like a dissonant melody. Sarah's call sign, Shadow, wasn't just a nod to her ability to maneuver undetected, it symbolized her resilience. The title had been earned on a mission where her stealth had turned the tide in her team's favor. But today felt different. The stakes were higher, not just for her squadron, but for the delicate balance of global politics. This was no routine sortie. This was the edge of a precipice. Her thoughts drifted to previous deployments, to decisions that had carved deep scars in her psyche. She carried the weight of lives lost and saved, the blurred line between duty and morality etched into her memory. She clenched her fists, bringing herself back to the present. This was her world now, a battlefield that extended far beyond the physical realm. In Washington, D.C., Ambassador Mark Tully paced his office, the rich burgundy of the carpet absorbing the weight of his hurried steps. His hands were clasped behind his back, his face a map of worry. The deadline to respond to Taiwan's plea for aid loomed closer, each tick of the clock echoing louder in his mind. Mark was no stranger to high-stakes diplomacy, but this felt different, the culmination of decades of simmering tensions. The fragility of peace, he murmured to himself, pausing to look out the window at the bustling capital. His years in foreign service had taught him that diplomacy was as much about timing as it was about strategy. He had seen peace treaties celebrated and alliances fractured, all within the same breath. This time, every word he chose could tip the scales. In a dimly lit operations room in Guam, Alex Rivera sat hunched over a bank of monitors. His fingers flew across the keyboard, orchestrating a symphony of code. A cyber specialist, Alex's role was as critical as any pilot's. In a world where wars were fought on digital fronts, he was a soldier without a uniform, defending against unseen enemies. "Looks like the hackers didn't take a coffee break," he muttered, his tone laced with sarcasm. Humor was his armor, a way to deflect the weight of the escalating conflict. He had intercepted an alarming number of intrusion attempts in the last 24 hours, each one more sophisticated than the last. The stakes were personal for Alex. He had family back in Manila, just across the waters from this brewing storm, and every line of code he wrote felt like a shield for their safety. Across the Pacific, aboard a Chinese naval destroyer, General Chiang Shen stood at the bridge, his hands gripping the polished railing as he surveyed the preparations below. The decks buzzed with activity as soldiers loaded supplies and double-checked weapon systems. Chiang's nickname, the Dragon, was a testament to his fierce and uncompromising leadership. "For the future of China," he muttered, the phrase both a mantra and a justification. His career had been built on calculated risks and bold strategies, but even he could feel the weight of this mission. The Taiwan Strait represented more than a strategic choke point. It was a symbol of national pride and sovereignty. Success would cement his legacy, but failure was not an option he allowed himself to consider. In Beijing, Major Li Na's fingers hovered over her keyboard, poised to strike. The Cyber Warfare Division was the nerve center of China's digital operations, and Li Na was its most skilled operator. Her monitors displayed a kaleidoscope of data streams, each one a potential vulnerability to exploit. Yet behind her steely exterior, doubts lingered. She had read the intercepted communications, seen the pleas of civilians caught in the crossfire of geopolitical chess. The human cost of their operations haunted her in quiet moments. But duty was duty, and her nation's needs came first, or so she told herself. As dawn approached across the Pacific, these players braced themselves for the decisions that would shape the days ahead. The gathering storm was not merely a metaphor, it was a reality hurtling toward them, a maelstrom of conflict that would test their loyalties and beliefs. In the quiet before the chaos, each one of them, pilot, diplomat, hacker, and soldier, prepared to play their part in the unfolding drama. Chapter 2. Into the Fray. The pre-dawn sky over Guam was a canvas of deep indigo, streaked with the faint promise of sunrise. Captain Sarah Owens' squadron gathered around the briefing table, the room filled with the low hum of voices and the occasional rustle of flight suits. The tension was palpable as their commanding officer strode in, his presence silencing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but firm, "China has escalated. Overnight, missile tests were conducted over the Taiwan Strait. Our intelligence confirms that their naval forces are mobilizing aggressively. This isn't a drill." Sarah's stomach tightened. She glanced around the table, meeting the eyes of her fellow pilots. Each face mirrored her own resolve, tempered with a hint of apprehension. The stakes had officially risen, and their mission was no longer about deterrence. It was about defense. The briefing was succinct, detailing their sortie's objectives: reconnaissance, deterrence, and, if necessary, engagement. As the pilots dispersed to their aircraft, Sarah took a moment to center herself. She placed a hand on the sleek fuselage of her jet, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingertips. This machine was her weapon, her shield, her sanctuary. In Washington, D.C., Ambassador Tully sat in a high-stakes video conference with key allies. The digital room was a mosaic of solemn faces, each representing a nation weighing its options. Tully's voice carried the weight of conviction as he outlined the consequences of inaction. "If we do not stand with Taiwan now," he said, his tone measured but urgent, "we send a message to every authoritarian regime watching. We cannot afford to falter." The responses were varied, ranging from cautious agreement to outright hesitation. Tully knew this was the nature of diplomacy, a dance of words where every step had to be calculated. Yet the urgency in his chest wouldn't abate. This was a moment that demanded decisiveness. Back in Guam, Alex Rivera's fingers moved with practiced precision across his keyboard. The cyber attacks had increased tenfold, each one a calculated attempt to disrupt communications and sow chaos. His colleagues worked in tandem, their faces illuminated by the glow of their monitors. "Another intrusion attempt blocked," Alex announced, his voice cutting through the tension. "These guys are relentless. It's like playing whack-a-mole, but the stakes are global." Despite his quip, the gravity of the situation was not lost on him. The digital battlefield was as critical as the skies and seas, and Alex knew his work was a lifeline for those on the front lines. Aboard the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen reviewed the latest intelligence reports. The maps before him displayed a complex web of naval movements, each line and marker representing a piece in the grand chess game of strategy. His officers awaited his orders, their expressions a mix of anticipation and resolve. "We proceed as planned," Chiang declared, his voice unwavering. "The world watches, and we will not falter." In the Cyber Warfare Division in Beijing, Major Li Na monitored the digital activity with an unflinching gaze. Her team worked in synchronized efficiency, executing her commands with precision. Yet as she intercepted another encrypted transmission, a pang of unease stirred within her. The messages were not just data points. They were glimpses into the lives of those caught in the crossfire. She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, the stage was set. In the skies above, on the seas below, and across the digital expanse, the players moved into position. The fray had begun, and the decisions made in these moments would echo far beyond the immediate battlefields. Chapter 3. The Changing Tides. Captain Sarah Owens tightened her grip on the flight controls, her eyes scanning the horizon. The reconnaissance mission had shifted into something more volatile, as radar detected an approaching Chinese aircraft. The orders crackled over the radio: "Maintain position, but be ready to engage." Sarah's breathing steadied as her squadron adjusted their formation. The enemy jets were closing in, their intentions unclear but their presence undeniable. "Shadow, this is Viper. Target confirmed. Range 20 miles and closing fast." Her wingman's voice came through with an edge of tension. "Roger that, Viper. Stay sharp," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She could feel the weight of the moment, the precarious balance between deterrence and direct conflict. In Washington, Ambassador Tully faced his own challenge. The video conference had devolved into heated debates. Some allies advocated for immediate military support, while others cautioned restraint. Tully leaned forward, his voice cutting through the clamor. We must act with clarity and unity. A fragmented response only emboldens aggression. His words hung in the air, a rallying cry tempered by the gravity of their decision. Across the digital expanse, he could see the wheels turning in his counterparts' minds. The stakes were too high for hesitation. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen received a report that confirmed the proximity of American aircraft. His officers awaited his command, their expressions a blend of anticipation and apprehension. Chiang's gaze remained fixed on the tactical display. Hold our course. Let them make the first move, he ordered, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of tension. In the dimly lit operations room in Guam, Alex Rivera worked furiously to counter a new wave of cyber attacks. The enemy's tactics had evolved, their methods more insidious. They're probing our communications networks, he called out. If they breach this, they'll disrupt everything. Alex deployed countermeasures with practiced precision, his fingers a blur on the keyboard. Despite the pressure, he managed a wry smile. Just another day at the office, saving the world one line of code at a time. Back in Beijing, Major Li Na reviewed intercepted transmissions that hinted at escalating tensions in the Taiwan Strait. Her hands hesitated over the keyboard as she decoded a message detailing civilian evacuation efforts in Taiwan. The human cost of their actions loomed large in her mind, a silent weight she could not ignore. Major, we have new directives, an officer informed her. Li Na nodded, steeling herself. Duty demanded action, but her conscience whispered questions she dared not voice. As the sun climbed higher, the tides of conflict shifted. In the skies above the Pacific, Sarah and her squadron maintained their vigil, their presence a testament to resolve. On the seas below, naval forces maneuvered with calculated precision, each move a statement of intent. And in the digital realm, unseen battles raged, shaping the course of events as surely as any missile or bullet. Chapter 4: Convergence. The clouds thickened over the Pacific as Captain Sarah Owens led her squadron into a new formation. The hostile aircraft had entered visual range, their sleek silhouettes cutting through the morning haze. The radio came alive with chatter as Sarah's team prepared for a potential engagement. Shadow, I've got a lock on the lead jet, Viper's voice crackled through her headset. Hold fire until my command, Sarah ordered, her voice steady. The rules of engagement were clear. Deterrence first, retaliation only if provoked. But the tension was electric, every pilot poised on a knife's edge. The Chinese jets mirrored their formation, flying dangerously close but holding their fire. It was a high-stakes game of chicken, each side testing the other's resolve. Sarah's instincts screamed for action, but she held back, knowing that a single misstep could ignite the conflict they were trying to avoid. In Guam, Alex Rivera monitored the situation from the operations room. The live feed from Sarah's squadron painted a stark picture on the main screen, the tiny icons representing jets locked in a tense standoff. Meanwhile, Alex fought off a fresh wave of cyber intrusions targeting their communication systems. We've got another breach attempt, Alex called out. His hands flew across the keyboard, deploying countermeasures. They're targeting our uplink. If they crack this, we'll lose contact with the squadron. Can you stop it? His supervisor asked, eyes glued to the screen. I'm trying, Alex replied through gritted teeth. But whoever's behind this knows their stuff. Aboard the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen watched the unfolding aerial confrontation with a mixture of pride and apprehension. His officers reported the progress of their cyber operations, the attacks designed to undermine American coordination without firing a single shot. Chiang nodded approvingly, but his focus remained on the tactical display. Maintain their attention in the air, he ordered. Our real victories will come without bloodshed. In Washington, Ambassador Tully received live updates on the aerial standoff. The room was thick with tension as analysts debated the implications of every maneuver. Tully rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the moment. This can't escalate, he said aloud, though the statement was more to himself than anyone else. We need to hold the line. One of his aides approached with a phone. Sir, Japan is requesting an urgent consultation. They're concerned about the spillover effects if this turns into a shooting war. Tully nodded, gesturing for the call to be patched through. Let's keep our allies aligned, he said, his voice firm. Unity is our best defense. Back in Beijing, Major Li Na monitored the cyber operations with an uncharacteristic unease. The team's progress was impressive, their intrusions testing the limits of American defenses. Yet, Li Na couldn't shake the image of civilian evacuations in Taiwan, the lives disrupted by the games of power being played at her keyboard. Her superior approached, a satisfied smile on his face. Excellent work, Major. At this rate, their systems will buckle. Thank you, sir, Li Na replied, forcing a smile. But as he walked away, she glanced back at the intercepted messages on her screen, her conscience stirring once more. The standoff over the Pacific continued, the tension mounting with every passing second. Sarah's squadron maintained their formation, each pilot hyper-aware of the potential for disaster. In the operations room, Alex's countermeasures finally held, securing the uplink and preserving their connection to the jets above. We're stable for now, Alex announced, leaning back in his chair with a sigh of relief. Good work, his supervisor replied. But stay sharp, this isn't over. As the day wore on, the clouds began to break, sunlight spilling through to illuminate the tense skies. For a moment, it seemed as though the confrontation might dissolve without violence. But the players on all sides knew that this was only the beginning. The tides of conflict had converged, setting the stage for battles yet to come. Chapter 5: The Crucible. The Pacific skies turned turbulent, the serene morning replaced by an ominous shroud of clouds. Captain Sarah Owens felt the shift in the air, the subtle change that signaled an impending storm, both in nature and in the escalating conflict. Her squadron held formation, each jet a gleaming sentinel against the backdrop of gray. The Chinese aircraft mirrored their movements, a menacing dance on the edge of confrontation. Shadow, this is Viper. Hostile jets are closing to within 10 miles, her wingman reported, his voice tight with anticipation. Sarah's pulse quickened, but her voice remained calm. Copy that, Viper. Hold steady. Let's not be the ones to fire the first shot. The radio crackled with updates from the rest of the squadron, each pilot hyper-focused on their instruments and the looming threat ahead. Sarah's mind raced through the scenarios they had drilled endlessly. Viper, this is Shadow. Do not engage unless fired upon, Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the tension gripping her chest. The Chinese jets now loomed closer, their distinct red and yellow insignias stark against the metallic gray of their fuselage. It was a silent reminder of the opposition's resolve, a mirror of their own. Shadow, they're at 5 miles and holding, came another voice, calm but clipped. Sarah clenched her jaw. The rules of engagement were clear. They were not to escalate unless absolutely necessary. Yet the enemy's maneuvers felt deliberately provocative, as if daring them to make the first move. Maintain formation, Sarah ordered. Her squadron was a tight unit, trained to act as one. In this crucible of tension, discipline was their greatest weapon. Meanwhile, in Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera was battling his own storm. They're attempting a mass data dump, he shouted over the hum of equipment. His team scrambled to respond, their fingers darting over keyboards. The attack was sophisticated, an attempt to overload and incapacitate their defensive systems. Alex's heart pounded as he deployed countermeasures, a bead of sweat trailing down his temple. They're clever, but not clever enough, Alex muttered under his breath. He launched a containment protocol, isolating the malicious data streams before they could inflict damage. Uplink to Shadow's squadron remains intact, he announced, relief coloring his voice. But he knew this was only a small victory in an ongoing battle. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen observed the tactical display. His officers reported the progress of the cyber operations, but his attention was fixated on the aerial standoff. Hold them, at the line, he ordered. His strategy was clear, to push the Americans to their limit without crossing the threshold into outright conflict. It was a dangerous game of brinkmanship, but one he believed he could win. Back in the skies, Sarah monitored the jets on her radar. The Chinese formation began to shift, splitting into smaller groups that flanked her squadron. Shadow, this is Falcon. They're boxing us in, her second-in-command reported. I see it, Sarah replied. Maintain altitude and speed. Don't let them corner us. Her mind worked quickly, calculating their options. The Chinese pilots were skilled, their maneuvers precise, but Sarah's squadron had the advantage of cohesion and superior technology. "Shadow, they're signaling," Viper called out. Sarah glanced at her communication panel. The Chinese jets had broadcast a signal, an encoded message. She switched to a secure frequency. "Alex, do you copy?" "Loud and clear, Shadow," Alex replied. "Can you decrypt this transmission?" "They're trying to communicate." "Give me a minute," Alex, already typing furiously. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Sarah awaited his response. Finally, his voice crackled through her headset. "They're proposing a rendezvous," Alex said. "Neutral territory for discussion." On the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang received confirmation that their signal had been acknowledged. He nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Prepare a response team," he ordered. "Let us see if they are willing to talk." Back in the Pacific skies, Sarah weighed her options. A rendezvous was risky, but it might be their best chance to defuse the situation. "Falcon, take over the squadron. I'm going to meet them," she said, her voice firm. "Shadow, are you sure that's wise?" Falcon asked. "No," Sarah admitted, "but it's necessary." With that, she broke formation, her jet slicing through the turbulent air toward the designated coordinates. Behind her, the two opposing squadrons hovered in a fragile balance, the weight of their actions poised to tip the scales of history. Chapter 6. The Parley Captain, Sarah Owens, flew toward the rendezvous point, her jet cutting through the thickening clouds. The coordinates provided by the Chinese squadron were perilously close to international waters, a clear signal of their desire to maintain neutrality while testing boundaries. Her comms buzzed with the voices of her squadron, Falcon's steady leadership keeping the formation intact as she moved out alone. "Shadow, we're tracking you," Alex's voice reassured her through the secure channel. "If anything looks off, we'll have your six." "Copy that," Sarah replied, her tone calm despite the swirling tension in her mind. She could see the designated Chinese aircraft ahead, hovering like a predator waiting for its prey. With a deep breath, she switched to an open frequency. "This is Captain Sarah Owens, United States Air Force," she announced. "Approaching as requested. State your intentions." The Chinese pilot's response came almost immediately, his tone measured but firm. "Captain Owens, this is Commander Zheng Wei of the People's Liberation Army Air Force. We propose a dialogue to avoid unnecessary escalation. Follow my lead to the meeting point." "Understood," Sarah replied, trailing Zheng's jet as it veered toward a small neutral airstrip on a rocky atoll. Her pulse quickened as the ground came into view. It was barren except for the faint outlines of structures, a forgotten remnant of wartime logistics repurposed for this moment. In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully received real-time updates on Sarah's mission. His office was a hive of activity, aides and analysts flooding him with reports. He clenched his fists as he listened to her comms. "This is risky," he said aloud, addressing no one in particular. "If they turn this into a trap, we'll be forced to retaliate. But if it works," one of his aides interjected, "it could buy us valuable time to solidify our alliances." Tully nodded. He was walking a tightrope between caution and boldness, each decision a step toward potential disaster or resolution. Sarah touched down on the weathered airstrip, the shriek of her jet's brakes cutting through the humid air. Opposite her, a Chinese J-20 stealth fighter landed gracefully, its sleek frame exuding quiet menace. As the engines wound down, Sarah removed her helmet, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of subterfuge. The cockpit of the J-20 opened, and Commander Zheng stepped out, his uniform crisp against the island's rugged backdrop. He walked with purpose toward Sarah, flanked by two unarmed soldiers. Sarah mirrored his approach, her boots crunching on the uneven tarmac. "Captain Owens," Zheng greeted her with a nod, his English precise but accented. "Thank you for accepting our proposal." "Commander Zheng," Sarah replied, keeping her tone professional. "What's the purpose of this meeting?" Zheng gestured toward a makeshift shelter constructed from what appeared to be salvaged metal sheets. "Let us speak candidly, away from the noise of our respective forces." Inside the shelter, the air was thick with the scent of salt and rust. A simple table and two chairs were the only furnishings. Zheng gestured for Sarah to sit before taking his place opposite her. "Our nations are at the brink," Zheng began. The situation in the Taiwan Strait grows more precarious by the hour. Neither of us wants war, yet we are poised for it. Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. If you don't want war, Commander, why escalate? Missile tests, cyber attacks, these are not the actions of a nation seeking peace. Zheng folded his hands on the table. And your presence in our waters is not a gesture of restraint, Captain. We both act as we are commanded, each believing in the righteousness of our cause. Sarah leaned forward. Then why call for this meeting? What are you hoping to achieve? For the first time, Zheng hesitated. His expression softened, a flicker of humanity breaking through his calculated demeanor. A delay, time to convince those above us that dialogue is the better path. Back in Guam, Alex listened intently to the live transmission. They're stalling, he muttered, his fingers poised over his keyboard in case the situation took a turn. But a small part of him hoped Zheng's intentions were genuine, a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak scenario. In the shelter, Sarah studied Zheng. He was not the caricature of an enemy she had imagined. Instead, he was a man carrying the same burdens as she, bound by duty, yet yearning for something greater. I'll relay your request, Sarah said finally. But understand this. If your actions contradict your words, this opportunity will vanish. Zheng inclined his head. As will ours, Captain. Let us hope our leaders see reason. The meeting concluded without incident, both pilots returning to their jets. As Sarah ascended into the skies, she felt a strange mix of relief and unease. This fragile moment of understanding was a threadbare bridge stretched over a chasm of hostility. Only time would tell if it could hold. Chapter 7. Breaking the Chains. Captain Sarah Owens returned to her squadron, her mind clouded with the weight of the meeting. Zheng Wei's words lingered, his plea for delay, his evident weariness of a conflict they were both trapped in. As her F-35 rejoined formation, her headset buzzed with Falcon's voice. "Shadow, everything good up there?" "Affirmative," Sarah replied, her tone neutral. "We need to maintain formation. I'll debrief once we're back at base." Her squadron fell silent, sensing her resolve. Sarah's focus returned to her instruments, but her thoughts remained on the precarious balance they had just managed to uphold. In Guam, Alex Rivera replayed the intercepted audio from Sarah's meeting with Commander Zheng. His instincts screamed for caution. "A delay," he muttered, leaning back in his chair. "Could be a trick. Or maybe..." "Maybe what?" his colleague Mia asked from the adjacent console. "Maybe they're as desperate as we are to avoid this," Alex admitted. "It's just too clean. Why call for a rendezvous and not ask for something tangible?" "Maybe they already got what they wanted. Time," Mia suggested. "Or leverage," Alex countered, his fingers resuming their furious typing. He couldn't shake the suspicion that the Chinese cyber attacks would escalate now that Sarah's squadron was back in the air. In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully received a briefing from the Joint Chiefs. The reports detailed the neutral meeting point, Sarah's safe return, and Zheng Wei's ambiguous proposition. "A stalling tactic," one general declared, slamming a fist onto the conference table. "Classic bait and switch. They're buying time to move assets into the Taiwan Strait." "Or it's a genuine plea for diplomacy," Tully interjected, his tone sharp. "We cannot afford to dismiss every overture as deceit." "And if it is deceit," the general challenged, "what's our counter?" Tully exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We tread carefully, move forward as though every word is calculated, but keep our lines open. If there's even a sliver of truth to their hesitation, we need to exploit it." Meanwhile, aboard the Chinese destroyer, General Chang Shen studied his own reports. Zheng Wei's transmission had reached Beijing, sparking debates within their command structure. Chiang's expression was inscrutable as he listened to his subordinates. "Commander Zheng risks appearing weak," one officer declared. "If the Americans sense hesitation, they'll strike first." Chiang raised a hand, silencing the room. "Or they'll hesitate too, giving us time to fortify. Every move on this board has purpose." He turned to his communications officer. "What of our digital front?" "Significant progress, General. We've identified vulnerabilities in their logistics networks. With your approval, we can exploit them within the next 48 hours. Chiang nodded. "Proceed, but ensure no action traces back to us." As Sarah's squadron neared Guam, Alex's voice broke through the static. "Shadow, this is Ops. We've detected increased digital traffic from the PLA. Something's brewing on their side." Understood, Sarah replied. Falcon, take us in for a debrief. We need to stay sharp. The jets landed in perfect unison, their engines roaring one final time before powering down. Sarah climbed out of her cockpit, her boots hitting the tarmac with purpose. She headed straight for the briefing room, where her commanding officer awaited. The debrief was tense. Sarah relayed every detail of her meeting with Zheng, her words met with mixed reactions from the room. They're playing us, one officer growled. They're stalling to gain the upper hand. Possibly, Sarah conceded. But if they wanted to escalate, they had every opportunity to ambush me at the rendezvous. They didn't. That tells me there's more to this than deception. Her commanding officer leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Captain, do you believe Zhang Wei? I believe he's a soldier like me, Sarah replied, bound by duty but aware of the stakes. If there's a chance his request for delay is genuine, we need to explore it. The room fell silent, tension thick in the air. That night, Sarah stood, alone on the base's observation deck, the vast Pacific stretching out before her. The stars blinked above, indifferent to the struggles of those below. She thought of Zheng Wei, his measured words, his evident conflict. Shadow, you okay? Falcon's voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah turned to see him approaching, his silhouette outlined by the dim light. Yeah, just thinking. You think he meant it? Falcon asked. Sarah sighed. I don't know, but if there's a chance to stop this before it starts, isn't it worth considering? Falcon nodded, joining her in gazing out at the endless horizon. Let's hope someone up the chain agrees with you. In the distance, the faint glow of a storm cloud lit up the night sky, a silent reminder of the conflict looming ever closer. Chapter 8. The Edge of the Storm. The air in Guam's operations room was thick with tension. Screens flickered with data streams, live satellite images, and encrypted communications. Alex Rivera paced the narrow space behind his console, his mind racing as he parsed through the latest cyber activity from the PLA. They're not just probing anymore, Alex said, his voice cutting through the quiet murmur of his team. They've shifted tactics. It's targeted now. Logistics, communications, even satellite uplinks. They're building a digital cage. What's the endgame? Mia asked, her eyes never leaving her monitor. Isolation, Alex replied grimly. If they sever enough connections, they'll cripple our ability to coordinate, leaving the forces in the Pacific blind. In the command briefing room, Captain Sarah Owens stood at attention, her posture rigid as her commanding officer laid out the latest developments. Cyber attacks are intensifying, the CO said, gesturing to a map of the Pacific dotted with flashing alerts. Zheng Wei's request for a delay might have been genuine, but their digital front is telling a different story. What's our next move? Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the growing knot in her stomach. We maintain readiness and escalate our countermeasures, the CO replied. Your squadron will be on high alert. If this turns into a shooting war, you'll be our first line of defense. Back in Beijing, Major Li Na sat at her terminal, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The directives from her superiors were clear. Maximize disruption, exploit vulnerabilities. Yet the intercepted communications from the American side gnawed at her conscience. They were not the cries of an aggressor, but of a force trying to hold its ground. Major, progress on the satellite uplinks, her superior barked, snapping her back to the present. Nearly complete, Li Na replied, her voice devoid of emotion. Her hands moved automatically, executing commands she knew could tilt the balance irrevocably. She told herself it was necessary, but the weight of those actions pressed heavier with each passing moment. Meanwhile, aboard the Chinese destroyer, General Chang Shen monitored his tactical displays. His officers reported the progress of their digital offensive, each success adding to their confidence. Maintain pressure, Chang ordered. If they cannot communicate, they cannot act. One of his aides hesitated before speaking. General, the Americans intercepted Commander Zheng's transmission. Do you believe it will delay their actions? Chang's eyes remained fixed on the map. It does not matter what they believe. Every hour we gain is another step toward our objective. Sarah and her squadron remained on standby, their jets fueled and ready. She sat in the cockpit of her F-35, helmet resting on her lap as she stared out at the hangar's open doors. The sky beyond was a shifting canvas of gray, the storm brewing on the horizon, a mirror of the tension within. Shadow, You there? Falcon's voice crackled through her headset. Yeah, I'm here, Sarah replied, slipping the helmet back on. What's up? Just got word from Ops, Falcon said. PLA forces are moving closer to Taiwan's southern coast. Looks like they're positioning for something big. Sarah clenched her fists. Then we'll be ready. In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully was deep in conversation with Allied leaders. The urgency in his voice carried across the secure video link. We need a united front, Tully said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. If we fracture now, we'll lose the initiative. We must present a clear, unwavering stance. The Japanese ambassador nodded, his expression grave. We agree, but action without caution could escalate matters beyond control. Have we confirmed their intentions? Tully exhaled sharply. We're working on it. In the meantime, we need to prepare for all possibilities. The first drops of rain began to fall as Sarah's squadron was ordered into the air. The storm clouds that had loomed earlier now engulfed the skies, lightning illuminating the horizon in jagged flashes. Shadow, this is Falcon. Formation tight and steady. Looks like the weather's against us tonight. Copy that, Sarah replied, her voice firm. She scanned her instruments, the faint blips of unidentified aircraft appearing at the edge of her radar. Her squadron flew into the darkness, their jets cutting through the turbulence like knives. As they neared the contested airspace, Sarah's comms came alive with an alert from Ops. Shadow, be advised. PLA aircraft are inbound. Maintain current trajectory, but be ready to engage. Sarah's heart raced as she relayed the instructions to her team. The tension in her cockpit was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like the storm above. Shadow, this is Viper. Visual on hostiles, her wingman reported. Hold formation, Sarah ordered. Do not engage unless provoked. The Chinese jets appeared in the distance, their formation a stark silhouette against the roiling clouds. The two squadrons closed the gap, the air between them charged with unspoken hostility. Shadow, they're signaling again, Alex's voice broke through the static. Same channel as before. They're asking for contact. Sarah's grip tightened on the controls. Patch them through. The voice of Commander Zheng Wei filled her headset, calm but urgent. Captain Owens, we meet again under less favorable circumstances. Commander Zheng, Sarah replied, her tone clipped. Care to explain why your forces are advancing while you preach restraint? This is not my doing, Zheng said. There are forces on both sides pushing for escalation, but I am here to ensure it does not go too far. Then you'd better rein them in fast, Sarah shot back. We're holding our fire, but my patience isn't infinite. Understood, Zheng replied, but I need you to trust me once more. Trust goes both ways, Commander, Sarah said, and right now I'm fresh out of it. The comms fell silent as the two squadrons flew parallel, the storm a volatile backdrop to their fragile ceasefire. Above the crashing waves and the howling wind, the world teetered on the brink, the balance of power hanging by a thread. Chapter 9. The Storm Breaks. The skies over the Pacific were a chaotic expanse of lightning and shadow, each flash illuminating the opposing squadrons flying in tense parallel. Captain Sarah Owens felt the hum of her F-35 systems vibrating through her fingertips, a constant reminder of the power and responsibility she wielded. Across the void, the Chinese jets held formation, their intent obscured by the storm and the silence that followed. Zheng Wei's final words. Shadow, they're maintaining their distance, Viper's voice cut through the comms. But something feels off. Sarah agreed. The storm wasn't just external. It was in the air between the two forces, a gathering tempest of doubt, mistrust, and the ever-present threat of a miscalculated move. Stay sharp, Viper. Nobody flinches unless I give the word, Sarah replied, her voice steady. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that the next moment could spiral out of control. In Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera watched the situation unfold on his monitor, the live radar feed showing the two squadrons locked in their precarious dance. His heart sank as another alert flashed on his screen. Incoming data spike, Alex called out to his team. They're flooding our channels again, but this time it's different. What's different? Mia asked, leaning over his shoulder. They're not targeting comms, they're going for navigation, Alex said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. If they succeed, our jets could lose GPS guidance. Can you block it? Mia pressed. I'm trying, Alex said, his tone strained. But this isn't just an attack, It's a takeover attempt. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen monitored his tactical display. The digital battlefield was his domain, and his officers were executing his orders with precision. The Americans' navigation systems are compromised, an officer reported. Should we proceed with the next phase? Chiang hesitated, his gaze fixed on the blinking markers that represented Sarah's squadron. Not yet. Let them see the vulnerability. Force them to retreat. In the cockpit of her F-35, Sarah's warning systems began to blare. "Shadow, this is Ops." Alex's voice came through, tense but controlled. "They're targeting your navigation systems. You may lose GPS." "Understood," Sarah replied. "Falcon, relay to the squadron. Prepare for manual operation if necessary." "Copy that, Shadow," Falcon confirmed, his voice calm but resolute. The storm intensified, rain lashing against the jets and lightning slicing through the sky. Sarah switched her systems to manual override, her hands steady on the controls as she prepared for the worst. "Shadow, this is Viper. Hostiles are shifting formation. Looks like they're trying to surround us." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Maintain position, but stay ready. If they close in, we'll have no choice but to engage." At the same time, in Beijing, Major Lina stared at her monitor, her unease growing with every passing second. The coordinated digital assault she had been orchestrating was nearing its peak, but something about it felt wrong. "Major, the American systems are on the verge of collapse," an officer reported. "Shall we proceed with total disruption?" Lina hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The faces of displaced civilians from Taiwan flashed in her mind, their plight a consequence of the very actions she was enabling. "Delay the final phase," Lina ordered, her voice firm. "I want a full assessment of their response capabilities before we proceed." The officer frowned but nodded. "Yes, Major." Back in the skies, Sarah watched as the Chinese jets drew closer. Her heart pounded as she made a decision. "Shadow to Zheng," she said, opening the secure channel. "If you want me to trust you, now's the time to prove it. Call your pilots off." Zheng's voice came through, calm but strained. "Captain Owens, my authority only extends so far. There are forces within my command pushing for escalation." "Then stop them," Sarah snapped, "or the next move will be ours." A tense silence followed, broken only by the roar of the storm and the hum of her jet's engine. Finally, Zheng responded. "I will do what I can, but you must hold your fire." "You have 5 minutes," Sarah said. "After that, all bets are off." In Guam, Alex's console flashed green, signaling a breakthrough. "I've stabilized the nav systems," he called out, relief flooding his voice. "They've lost their window of control." "Great work," Mia said, clapping him on the shoulder. "But what about the standoff? Can we give them anything from here?" "Not much," Alex admitted, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "But I can make sure we keep them connected. If Zheng is genuine, Sarah needs every advantage she can get." As the clock ticked down, the Chinese jets began to peel away, their formation breaking as Zheng's voice came through Sarah's headset once more. "They're withdrawing," he said. "For now." Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Good call, Zheng. Let's hope it sticks." "It will," Zheng replied, though his tone betrayed his uncertainty. "But you must act swiftly. The forces pushing for war on both sides are relentless." "Understood," Sarah said. "Stay safe, Commander." "And you, Captain," Zheng replied before the line went silent. As the storm began to abate, Sarah's squadron returned to their base, their jets landing with practiced precision. She climbed out of her cockpit, exhaustion etched into her features as she headed straight for the debriefing room. In the command center, her report was met with cautious optimism. "It seems Zheng Wei is as conflicted as you thought," her CO said. "But this withdrawal buys us time we can't waste." Sarah nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. The storm had broken, but the winds of conflict still loomed, ready to rise again at the slightest provocation. Chapter 10. The Silent Buildup. The calm after the storm in Guam was deceptive. The sky over the airbase had cleared, revealing a golden horizon as the sun dipped below the Pacific, but the tension on the ground remained thick. Captain Sarah Owens sat in the debriefing room, her flight suit still damp from the earlier rain. Her commanding officer stood at the head of the table, the room silent except for the faint hum of air conditioning. "Captain Owens," the CO began, his voice measured. "The decision to engage in dialogue with Commander Zheng was a calculated risk. For now, it appears to have paid off. Sarah leaned forward, her elbows resting on the table. It bought us time, but Zheng's influence has limits. He as much as admitted that his superiors are still preparing for escalation. The CO nodded. Exactly. Our latest intelligence shows a steady buildup of PLA forces near Taiwan's southern coast. Naval assets are shifting, and their cyber operations haven't let up despite the withdrawal. What's our response? Sarah asked, her voice steady. We're coordinating with Allied forces, the CO replied. For now, your squadron remains on standby, but be ready to scramble at a moment's notice. Back in Beijing, Major Li Na reviewed the latest reports from the PLA's Cyber Warfare Division. The results were impressive. Critical vulnerabilities identified, systems disrupted, and a clear pathway for escalation should the order come. Yet her hesitation lingered. Major, her superior called, entering the room. We've received new directives. The final phase of operations is to be initiated within the next 24 hours. Li Na stiffened. Have we confirmed the Americans' ability to retaliate? Their digital countermeasures were stronger than anticipated. That is irrelevant, the superior replied sharply. This is a matter of national pride. Taiwan must be brought back under control. As the superior left, Li Na stared at her monitor, the weight of her choices pressing heavily on her chest. The cost of her duty had never felt more personal. In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully stood in front of a conference table surrounded by military and diplomatic leaders. The room was tense, each face etched with concern as maps of the Taiwan Strait were projected onto the wall. The PLA's withdrawal from the immediate area was temporary, Tully began. Their forces are repositioning for what appears to be a broader offensive. Cyber activities indicate attempts to cripple regional communication networks. A general leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. We need to move assets into the area, carrier groups, additional aircraft, missile defenses. If this escalates, we must be prepared to respond decisively. Tully nodded but raised a hand. We can't lose sight of the diplomatic angle. If Zheng Wei's actions are an indication, there may still be internal divisions within the PLA. That's leverage we can't ignore. Leverage only works if the other side respects strength, the general countered. Without a show of force, any diplomatic overture will be seen as weakness. The debate raged on, the line between diplomacy and military action blurring with each passing moment. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen received a report detailing the latest troop movements. His officers stood at attention as he examined the data, his expression unreadable. General, one officer began cautiously, there are reports of dissent within our ranks. Commander Zhang's unauthorized meeting with the Americans has sparked discussion. Chiang's gaze flicked to the officer, his voice cold. Discussion leads to division. Division leads to failure. Ensure the chain of command remains intact. Yes, General, the officer replied, bowing slightly before leaving the room. Chiang turned back to the tactical display, his thoughts hidden behind a steely exterior. The chessboard was set, and every piece had its place. The next move would be his. As night fell in Guam, Sarah returned to her quarters, the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring out the small window at the quiet airfield. Her thoughts turned to Zheng Wei, his words replaying in her mind. Trust me once more. Could she? Should she? The question gnawed at her. Despite everything, she felt a strange kinship with Zheng. They were both soldiers caught in a web spun by forces far beyond their control. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Falcon stood on the other side, his expression serious. Shadow Ops just called. They're moving us to high alert, he said. Sarah stood, her resolve hardening. What's the latest? PLA naval movements. Looks like they're setting up a blockade near Taiwan, Falcon replied. They're daring us to respond. Sarah grabbed her flight jacket, her eyes narrowing. Then we'd better be ready. Across the Pacific, in a dimly lit cyber operations room, Alex Rivera was piecing together the latest PLA tactics. His fingers danced across the keyboard, his mind racing to stay one step ahead of the relentless attacks. Got something, he muttered to himself, pulling up a set of intercepted communications. Looks like they're coordinating satellite jamming with ground operations. If they pull this off, he trailed off, the implications clear. Alex tapped his headset, connecting to his superior. Sir, we've got a problem. If they jam our satellites, it's not just comms. They could disrupt everything from navigation to missile guidance. What's your recommendation? His superior asked. Alex hesitated. We need to counter now, before they finish setting up. If we wait, they'll have the upper hand. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the Pacific theater held its breath. Forces on all sides were moving, the silent build-up to a confrontation that felt inevitable. Sarah's squadron sat ready, their jets gleaming under the floodlights of the airbase. In Beijing and Washington, leaders weighed their options, every decision fraught with consequence. And on the vast ocean below, the Chinese and Allied fleets maneuvered into position, their intentions veiled, but their readiness clear. The storm may have broken, but the waves of conflict were rising once more. Chapter 11. Lines in the Water. The early hours of the morning brought a tense stillness over Guam's airbase. Captain Sarah Owens stood by her F-35, the cold metal of the fuselage a grounding presence beneath her hand. Around her, her squadron moved with purpose, the quiet efficiency of seasoned pilots preparing for the unknown. Shadow, ops just confirmed satellite jamming attempts are underway, Falcon said, approaching her. His tone was serious but steady. Alex and his team are working to counter, but we're flying into a digital fog. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Then we rely on what we've trained for. Manual systems, visual confirmation. If it comes to that, we adapt. Falcon smirked faintly. Always the optimist, Shadow. More like a realist, Sarah replied, her lips curling into a brief, tight smile. Get the squadron ready. We may not get another chance to breathe. In Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera was locked in a battle of ones and zeros. His screen displayed cascading lines of code as he worked to intercept and disrupt the PLA's attempts to blind Allied forces. Mia, reroute through the secondary uplink, Alex barked, his voice cutting through the chatter. They're targeting the primary satellite, but if we can split their focus. Already on it? Mia interrupted, her fingers flying across her keyboard. But they're throwing everything at us. This is coordinated. Of course it is, Alex muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. These aren't amateurs, but neither are we. Above the Pacific, the Allied and PLA fleets edged closer to confrontation. Ships lined the water like chess pieces, their movements deliberate yet menacing. On the deck of a U.S. destroyer, Admiral Karen Hart watched the unfolding scene through binoculars. PLA vessels are holding their positions, Admiral, her XO reported, but they're broadcasting warnings on all frequencies. Hart lowered the binoculars, her jaw tightening. What's their message? Standard rhetoric, the XO replied. Any violation of their declared zone will be met with force. Hart exhaled slowly. And what's our response? Standing orders, ma'am, the XO said. We're to maintain presence but avoid provocation. Hart's lips thinned. Provocation's a matter of interpretation at this point. In Beijing, Major Li Na observed the live feed from the PLA's Naval Command Center. The chessboard had shifted. The stakes were higher. She reviewed her team's progress on the satellite jamming operation, her unease growing with every success. Major, her subordinate called out. We've achieved partial disruption of their comms network. Full blackout expected within the hour. Li Na nodded mechanically. Good work. But her mind was elsewhere. Each victory felt like a step closer to catastrophe, the point of no return inching nearer. She wondered if anyone else in the room felt the same weight pressing down on her chest. Back in Guam, Sarah's squadron took to the skies, their jets slicing through the dawn like blades. The comms buzzed with controlled chatter as they assumed formation, heading toward the Taiwan Strait. Shadow, this is Falcon. Radar shows PLA aircraft holding their line, but they've increased their patrols. Copy that, Sarah replied, scanning her instruments. Keep an eye out for anything unexpected. As they neared the contested airspace, the first hints of interference became evident. Blips appeared and disappeared on Sarah's radar, the telltale signs of satellite disruption. Ops, this is Shadow. We're experiencing intermittent radar loss. Can you confirm? Alex's voice came through, tense but steady. Shadow, we're countering as best we can, but the interference is widespread. You'll need to rely on visuals if it gets worse. Understood, Sarah said. Falcon, inform the squadron, eyes up and alert. On board a Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen stood at the bridge, his officers reporting updates from both the naval and aerial fronts. American aircraft have entered the contested zone, one officer reported. They're holding formation. Chiang nodded, his expression unreadable. Do not engage unless fired upon. Maintain our position. General, another officer interjected, our satellite jamming is progressing as planned. Should we escalate? Chiang's gaze lingered on the tactical display. No, not yet. Let them see the futility of their presence first. The skies above the Taiwan Strait grew tense as Sarah's squadron approached the PLA's air patrol. The opposing jets mirrored their movements, the distance between them shrinking with every second. Shadow, hostiles at 2 o'clock, Viper called out. I see them. Sarah replied, her grip tightening on the controls. Hold formation, no sudden moves. The Chinese jets maintained their distance, their intent unclear. Sarah's comms buzzed with a familiar voice. Captain Owens, this is Commander Zheng Wei. The transmission crackled. We meet again. Commander Zheng, Sarah replied, keeping her voice even. Care to explain your fleet's actions? My fleet is holding its ground as your forces are, Zheng said. We are both bound by orders we cannot ignore. And the satellite jamming? Is that just holding your ground too? Sarah shot back. A pause. Then Zheng's voice returned, lower and more serious. Captain Owens, I suggest you pull back. The winds of war are strong, and those above us are eager to let them loose. Sarah's jaw tightened. Then stop them, because if they act, we will respond. I understand, Zheng said quietly, but understand this. My influence is finite. If conflict comes, I may not be able to reach you again. The comms fell silent, and Sarah's squadron flew on, the storm of tension growing heavier with each passing second. Below them, the waves churned, reflecting the unrest above. The lines in the water had been drawn, and both sides stood ready to cross them. Chapter 12, Crossing the Threshold. The Taiwan Strait stretched below, its waters a volatile mix of dark waves and pale foam reflecting the tension above. Captain Sarah Owens' F-35 held steady at the center of her squadron, each jet in perfect formation despite the hostile proximity of PLA aircraft. The radio was a quiet hum, the usual chatter muted as everyone braced for what seemed inevitable. Shadow, hostiles are matching our speed and trajectory, Falcon reported, his tone grim. It's like they're waiting for something. They are, Sarah replied. Her gut churned with the knowledge that the fragile equilibrium was moments from tipping. She keyed her mic. Ops, this is Shadow. Any updates on their comms or movements? Alex Rivera's voice crackled through her headset. Shadow, we're intercepting increased PLA chatter. They're coordinating something, but we can't nail down specifics. Understood, Sarah said, her eyes scanning the horizon. Keep me posted. In Guam's operations room, Alex leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched into his features as he stared at the overwhelming data on his screen. They're not just reacting, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. This is deliberate. They're setting something up. Mia glanced over. What are you thinking? I'm thinking they're baiting us, Alex replied. They want us to flinch first. The moment we do, they'll use it to justify an all-out engagement. Then we don't flinch, Mia said firmly. Alex nodded, but the knot in his stomach remained. The PLA's digital movements were too methodical, too precise. Something bigger was in motion, and time was running out to uncover it. In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully sat in the Situation Room, his hands clasped tightly on the table as live updates poured in. Satellite images of the Taiwan Strait filled the screens, dotted with the converging forces of both sides. PLA naval and air assets are maintaining formation, but their jamming efforts are escalating, an analyst reported. Our comms and navigation systems are holding, but just barely. Tully turned to the Joint Chiefs. What's our threshold for response? We don't fire unless they do, a general replied. But if they cross the line, they're already crossing it, Tully interrupted. Satellite jamming, encroachment on international waters. How much longer before it's too late to stop this? The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person present. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen stood at the bridge, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The American jets hovered just out of reach, their presence a thorn in his side. Yet he knew the stakes of an outright attack. General, additional orders from Beijing, an officer said, handing him a communique. Chiang read it carefully, his expression hardening. Increase air patrols, keep the Americans boxed in, but under no circumstances are we to fire first. The officer hesitated. General, with all due respect, how long can we hold this posture? Our forces are at their limit. As long as it takes, Jiang replied. This is not just a test of strength, it's a test of resolve. In Sarah's cockpit, the silence broke with a sudden alert. Her radar lit up with new blips, additional PLA jets entering the airspace. Shadow, this is Falcon, her second-in-command called. We've got more company. They're closing fast. Sarah's heart raced as she assessed the situation. Ops, confirm hostiles? Alex's voice came through, tense but steady. Shadow, confirmed. Looks like reinforcements. They're stacking the deck. Sarah keyed her mic to her squadron. Stay tight. Do not engage unless fired upon. Let them make the first move. As the new PLA jets closed in, the space between the two squadrons shrank to a hair's breadth. It was an aerial standoff of unprecedented tension, every pilot on both sides waiting for the inevitable spark. In Beijing, Major Li Na watched the digital battlefield unfold on her screen. The satellite jamming had reached its peak, and PLA forces were poised for action. Yet something about the entire operation gnawed at her conscience. Major, final confirmation to execute full comms disruption, an officer said, awaiting her command. Li Na hesitated, her hand hovering over the keyboard. The voices of Taiwanese civilians she had intercepted earlier replayed in her mind. Pleas for safety, messages to loved ones, desperate prayers. Her resolve wavered. Delay execution, she ordered, her voice firm but low. The officer frowned. Major, with respect. I said delay, Li Na snapped. I want to ensure we're not exposing our own vulnerabilities in the process. The officer reluctantly complied, and Li Na exhaled, her chest heavy with the weight of defiance. Back over the strait, Sarah's squadron remained locked in formation, the PLA jets circling like vultures. The storm clouds from earlier had returned, casting the skies in a dark, ominous hue. Shadow, they're pushing us, Falcon said, his tone tight. If they get any closer. They won't, Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. Suddenly the comms crackled with an unexpected transmission. Captain Owens, Zheng Wei's voice came through, strained and urgent. You must pull back. The chain of command is slipping. I cannot hold them. Sarah clenched her fists around the controls. Zheng, if your forces fire, this will escalate beyond anyone's control. I know, Zheng replied, but there are those above me who want just that. You must pull back now. Sarah hesitated, torn between duty and instinct. Zheng, if we pull back, it will look like weakness. And if you stay, it will look like provocation, Zheng countered. You must decide which is worse. On board the Chinese destroyer, Changshen received the latest report. The Americans are holding their position. An officer said, What are your orders? Chiang stared at the tactical display, his jaw tight. Hold the line. Let them break first. In the cockpit of her F-35, Sarah made her decision. Falcon, relay to the squadron. We're pulling back. Maintain defensive formation and head for international airspace. Copy that, Shadow, Falcon replied, though his tone hinted at surprise. As Sarah's squadron began to retreat, the PLA jets maintained their position, watching but not following. The tension in the air began to dissipate, though the threat of conflict still lingered. In Guam's operations room, Alex let out a long breath as the radar showed Sarah's squadron moving to safety. They're pulling back, he said aloud, relief evident in his voice. For now, Mia added, her expression cautious. But this isn't over. Alex nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen. No, it's not. As Sarah's squadron returned to base, the weight of the day's events settled heavily on her shoulders. She climbed out of her jet, exhaustion etched into every fiber of her being. Falcon approached her, his expression a mix of relief and curiosity. That was close, Shadow. What made you pull us back? Sarah looked at him, her eyes tired but resolute. Because sometimes the best way to hold the line is to take a step back. In the distance, the horizon remained dark, the storm refusing to fully dissipate. The threshold had been crossed, but the path ahead was far from clear. Chapter 13. Shadows of a Fragile Truce. The airbase in Guam was eerily quiet as the squadron taxied back to the hangar. Captain Sarah Owens removed her helmet, the cool night air biting at her flushed skin. She climbed out of her F-35, her legs heavy as she hit the tarmac. Around her, the rest of her team disembarked, their movements sluggish with exhaustion but precise from discipline. Falcon approached, his flight suit streaked with sweat. Shadow, I don't know how you stayed calm up there. Pulling back was a gamble. It wasn't calm, Falcon. It was calculated, Sarah replied. And it's not over. That was just the first test. In the operations room, Alex Rivera ran his fingers through his hair, exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes. The radar was clear for now, but the PLA's cyber operations continued to flicker on his monitors like a persistent virus. They're holding back, but just barely, Alex muttered. It's like they're waiting for us to drop our guard. Maybe they're recalibrating, Mia suggested from her console. Or maybe Zheng Wei's intervention bought us more time than we think. Alex shook his head. We can't bank on Zheng. He's met a cog in a much bigger machine. The room fell silent as Alex's terminal pinged with an encrypted message. He frowned, his fingers flying over the keyboard to decode it. What is it? Mia asked, leaning closer. It's a partial intercept from the PLA, Alex said, his voice low. Looks like internal chatter about a realignment of their forces. They're repositioning. Repositioning for what? Mia pressed. Alex's face darkened. For something bigger. In Beijing, Major Li Na sat alone at her terminal, the glow of the monitor casting harsh shadows on her face. Her team had left for the night, but she remained, scrolling through the logs of intercepted communications. Her hesitation earlier had not gone unnoticed, and she knew questions would follow. She opened a private channel and began composing a message, her fingers trembling slightly. To Commander Zheng Wei, subject, escalation imminent. Commander, your warnings to the Americans were noted, but insufficient. The High Command is preparing to initiate a full-scale blockade. I cannot intervene further without compromising myself. If you have any influence left, use it now. She hesitated before hitting send, her chest tight with a mix of fear and defiance. Back on the Chinese destroyer, General Chang Shen studied the latest reports. His officers had confirmed the American withdrawal, but the High Command's orders were clear. Maintain pressure, escalate if necessary. General, updated directives from Beijing, an officer announced, handing him a communique. Chiang read the message silently, his expression hardening. Prepare the fleet for a show of force. Ensure all units are in position within 24 hours. Are we to engage, sir? The officer asked. Not yet, Chiang replied, but make sure they believe we will. In Guam, Sarah sat in the debriefing room, the low hum of the overhead lights matching her wariness. Her commanding officer entered, a tablet in hand. Captain Owens, he began, his voice firm. The decision to withdraw was the right call, but intelligence suggests the PLA is doubling down. Naval realignments, increased aerial patrols, and chatter about blockades. Sarah nodded. They're escalating. Zheng Wei said as much. Her CO placed the tablet on the table. Your interaction with Zheng has raised some eyebrows at the Pentagon. They're wondering if we can use this connection to buy more time. With respect, sir, Zheng's influence is limited, Sarah said. He's trying, but he's constrained. The real decisions are coming from Beijing. The CO leaned back in his chair. Then let's make sure Beijing sees us as more than an adversary. If you're back in the air tomorrow, we'll authorize further communication with Zheng, but tread carefully. Later that night, Sarah stood on the observation deck overlooking the airstrip. The horizon was dark, the lights of the base a stark contrast to the vast emptiness beyond. She felt Falcon's presence before he spoke. Can't sleep either? He asked, stepping up beside her. Too much on my mind, Sarah replied. Every decision feels like walking a tight rope. Falcon nodded. We're all feeling it, but you've kept us steady, Shadow. That's what matters. I just hope it's enough, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. On board the Chinese destroyer, Zheng Wei received Li Na's encrypted message. His jaw tightened as he read her words, the reality of his limited power settling over him like a weight. Commander Zheng, message from General Chiang, a subordinate interrupted. Zheng turned, his face neutral. What does it say? We're to advance within 24 hours, all assets to be in position for a show of force. Zheng dismissed the subordinate, his mind racing. He had warned Sarah, but it might not be enough. His conscience warred with his duty, and for the first time he wondered if he could continue walking the fine line between loyalty and morality. As dawn approached, the Taiwan Strait grew eerily still, the forces on both sides poised like predators in the dark. The fragile truce held, but shadows moved beneath the surface. Each decision, each maneuver, each word spoken or withheld tightened the tension like a coiled spring. The lines had been drawn, and the storm had yet to pass. Chapter 14: The Breaking Point. The early light of dawn painted the skies above Guam in muted shades of gold and gray, but the beauty of the morning was lost on Captain Sarah Owens. She stood on the tarmac, her flight helmet tucked under her arm, as her squadron prepared their jets for another tense mission. The hum of activity around her, mechanics running pre-flight checks, fuel trucks rumbling past, was a stark contrast to the eerie stillness she felt inside. Her commanding officer approached, his expression as grim as the reports he carried. "Captain Owens, updated intelligence indicates PLA forces are moving into blockade positions. Satellite imagery confirms naval and aerial assets converging on Taiwan's key shipping lanes." Sarah straightened. "Have they engaged?" "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time," the CO said. "Command wants your squadron in the air. Maintain a strong presence, but avoid provocation. If Zheng reaches out again, keep the channel open." Sarah nodded, sliding her helmet on as she climbed into her F-35. The cockpit sealed around her, and she took a deep breath, steadying herself. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but she pushed it aside. Focus was her greatest weapon. In Beijing, Major Li Na sat at her workstation, her face lit by the glow of her monitor. The PLA's satellite jamming efforts had reached critical mass, and her team awaited her final authorization to execute the next phase. Yet, her mind was elsewhere. The intercepted communications from American forces painted a clear picture of restraint, strategic, deliberate, and hesitant to escalate. It was a stark contrast to the aggressive posturing of her own superiors. She knew what would happen if the PLA pushed too far, a retaliation that neither side could afford. "Major, we're ready," her subordinate said, breaking her thoughts. Li Na hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Delay execution," she said quietly. "I want a final diagnostic of our vulnerabilities before proceeding." The subordinate frowned. "But Major?" "Do it," Li Na snapped, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We cannot afford missteps." Over the Taiwan Strait, Sarah's squadron flew in tight formation, the tension palpable as they neared the contested zone. Falcon's voice crackled through her headset. "Shadow, radar's lighting up. Hostiles at 2 o'clock, closing fast." Sarah scanned her instruments, her grip tightening on the controls. "Maintain formation, hold position, do not engage unless fired upon." The PLA jets came into view, their sleek frames cutting through the morning haze. They mirrored the American formation, an aerial standoff as both sides waited for the other to blink. In Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera watched the radar feeds with growing unease. "They're baiting us," he muttered, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he monitored the PLA's digital activity. "What's new?" Mia asked from the console beside him. "This," Alex said, pointing to a series of flagged transmissions. "They're coordinating a naval maneuver. If they succeed, they'll lock down Taiwan's primary shipping lanes. It's not just a blockade, it's a chokehold." "Can we disrupt it?" Mia asked. "Trying," Alex replied, "but they've reinforced their defenses. We need time." "Time we don't have," Mia said grimly. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen received confirmation that the naval and air units were in position. His officers awaited his next command, their expressions a mix of anticipation and apprehension. "General, all forces are ready," an officer reported. "Shall we proceed?" Chiang stared at the tactical display, the blinking markers representing the PLA and American forces locked in their precarious dance. His superiors in Beijing had made their intentions clear, but the burden of execution rested squarely on his shoulders. "Hold position," Chiang ordered. "Let the Americans react first." In the cockpit of her F-35, Sarah's comms buzzed with a familiar voice. "Captain Owens," Commander Zheng Wei's voice came through, strained but steady. "You are entering a dangerous zone. I urge you to reconsider your position." "Commander Zheng," Sarah replied, her voice firm, "your forces are creating the danger. Pull them back before this turns into something neither of us can control." Zheng hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. "Captain Owens, I will attempt to intervene, but if my efforts fail, you must be prepared for the worst." "Zheng, we're all prepared," Sarah said, "but that doesn't mean we want this." The comms went silent, and Sarah's squadron held their position, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. In Beijing, Li Na received a message from Zheng, his words a plea for restraint. Her stomach churned as she read it. the weight of the conflict pressing harder on her conscience. She knew her next decision could tip the scales. Taking a deep breath, she activated a secure line to her immediate superior. "Sir, I recommend postponing the full execution of our satellite operations. We need to reassess the risk of escalation." Her superior's voice was cold. "Major Lee, your hesitation has been noted. Proceed with the operation, or I will find someone who will." Lena's hand trembled as she ended the call. Her choices were narrowing, and the consequences of inaction loomed large. The Taiwan Strait seemed to hold its breath as Sarah's radar picked up a sudden movement. A PLA jet veered out of formation, heading straight for her squadron. "Shadow, we've got movement!" Falcon shouted. "Hold position!" Sarah ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. The PLA jet closed the gap, its intentions unclear. Sarah's hand hovered over the weapons control, every nerve in her body screaming for restraint. The jet pulled up at the last moment, banking sharply to avoid direct confrontation. It was a provocation, a test of her resolve. "Shadow, what's the call?" Viper asked, tension thick in his voice. "Stay the course," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Do not engage." The PLA jets resumed their formation, but the message was clear. The line between peace and war was razor thin, and it was only a matter of time before it was crossed. Chapter 15: The Spark. The tension over the Taiwan Strait had reached its apex, the waters below reflecting the steel-gray sky and the deadly symmetry of the two forces above. Captain Sarah Owens held her F-35 steady, her eyes darting between her radar and the PLA jets still circling like vultures. Her squadron's formation remained tight, their discipline unyielding despite the provocative maneuvers of the enemy. "Shadow, they're testing us," Falcon said over the comms. "This is the third close pass. They're daring us to react." "I see it," Sarah replied, her voice clipped. "Hold your positions. No one moves unless I give the order." Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind remained sharp. The wrong move now would plunge them into a conflict neither side could afford. In Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera watched the radar feed with growing dread. "This is it," he muttered, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "They're setting the stage." "What are they doing?" Mia asked, leaning over his console. "They're coordinating an encirclement," Alex replied. "Naval and air assets are moving to cut off any retreat. If they pull this off, our forces will be boxed in." "Can we disrupt it?" Mia pressed. "Not in time," Alex said, his voice tight. "This is all up to them now." On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen stood at the bridge, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. The Americans had held their ground longer than anticipated, their restraint both admirable and frustrating. "General, additional orders from Beijing?" an officer said, handing him a communique. Chiang read the message, his expression hardening. "Prepare the next maneuver," he ordered. "We will force their hand." The officer hesitated. "Sir, if they respond, then we are ready," Chiang said, his voice cold. "This is the cost of reclaiming what is ours." Sarah's comms buzzed to life with Alex's voice. "Shadow, we've intercepted PLA chatter. They're moving to box you in. If they complete the maneuver, you'll have no escape route." "Understood," Sarah replied. "Falcon, relay to the squadron. Prepare for evasive action, but hold position for now." "Copy that," Falcon said. "Shadow, what's the play?" "We hold until we can't," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. In Beijing, Major Lena's unease had reached a breaking point. The reports flooding her terminal confirmed the escalation she had feared. The PLA's forces were closing in, and the next move would likely ignite the conflict. Her encrypted channel buzzed with a new message from Commander Zheng Wei. "Zheng, the situation is slipping. Intervention at the highest levels is no longer possible. Do what you can." Lena stared at the message, her heart pounding. For the first time in her career, she felt truly powerless. She closed the channel and turned back to her team. "Continue monitoring," she said, her voice devoid of emotion, "and prepare for contingencies." The PLA jets made another aggressive pass, this time closer than before. Sarah's radar lit up with warnings as her F-35 registered a potential lock-on. "Shadow, they're painting us," Viper shouted. "I see it," Sarah said. "Falcon, keep the squadron tight. Do not engage unless fired upon." Her comms buzzed again, this time with a voice she had come to recognize. "Captain Owens," Zheng Wei said, his tone urgent. I am trying to hold them, but my authority is limited. You must retreat now, or there will be no way back. Zheng, if we pull back, it gives the green light for your forces to advance. We can't do that, Sarah replied. Then prepare for what's coming, Zheng said, his voice heavy with resignation. On the deck of a U.S. destroyer, Admiral Karen Hart received the latest updates from Sarah's squadron. The tension in her voice mirrored the storm brewing in the skies. They've painted our aircraft, she said. If they fire, we retaliate. Her XO nodded grimly. Shall I prepare the missile batteries, ma'am? Yes, Hart replied, but do not launch unless they make the first move. The XO hesitated. And if they do? Hart's eyes narrowed. Then we hit back with everything we've got. The spark came suddenly, without warning. A PLA jet veered too, close to one of Sarah's wingmen, forcing him to make a sharp evasive maneuver. The sudden movement triggered a defensive reflex, and the wingman's system fired a warning flare. Shadow, that wasn't me, the pilot shouted. It was the system. It auto-deployed. Sarah's heart sank. The flare streaked through the air, harmless but unmistakable in its implication. The PLA jets responded immediately. One of them released a missile, its trajectory aimed just off the squadron's flank. A warning shot, but a shot nonetheless. Shadow, they fired, Falcon yelled. Maintain formation. Sarah barked, her voice cutting through the chaos. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Her comms buzzed with Alex's voice. Shadow Ops here. We're tracking a missile launch. What's the status? Warning shot, Sarah replied, but the situation is spiraling. Shadow, this is Falcon. They're closing in again, he said, his voice tight. They're forcing us to act. Sarah clenched her jaw, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed for action, but she knew the cost of escalation. Falcon, hold position. No one engages unless absolutely necessary. The air was electric, the silence between the two forces heavier than the storm clouds above. The first shot had been fired, but the next would determine whether the world plunged into war. Chapter 16. The Brink of Chaos. The missile's smoky contrail hung in the air, a ghostly reminder of how close the world was to catastrophe. Captain Sarah Owens tightened her grip on the controls of her F-35, her breathing steady despite the chaos erupting around her. Shadow, they're moving into attack formation, Falcon shouted through the comms. If we don't act, they'll box us in completely. Sarah scanned her radar. The PLA jets had spread out, a classic pincer maneuver designed to force her squadron into a defensive posture. Yet no additional missiles had been fired. They were playing a dangerous game, one designed to provoke without fully committing to combat. Falcon, hold formation, Sarah said, her voice sharp but controlled. We don't make the first move. They already did, Shadow, Viper argued, his frustration clear. What are we waiting for? Orders, Sarah replied firmly. Until they directly engage, we stay defensive. In Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera was glued to his screen, his fingers tapping furiously as he monitored the rapidly shifting situation. They've switched tactics, he muttered to Mia. That missile wasn't just a warning, it was a bait. What do you mean? Mia asked, leaning closer. They're trying to force us into escalating, Alex said, pulling up satellite imagery and radar overlays. Their jets are spreading out, creating the illusion of an imminent attack. If we respond, they can claim self-defense. Mia frowned. And if we don't respond, they tighten the noose, Alex said grimly. Either way, they're pushing us to the edge. On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chiang Shen stood at the bridge, watching his forces execute his orders with precision. His officers reported updates in clipped, efficient tones. General, the Americans are holding formation, one officer said. No further action so far. Chiang nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. Let them see their position is untenable. Sir, Commander Zheng has requested an urgent channel, another officer reported, his tone cautious. Patch him through, Chiang said, his voice betraying a hint of irritation. Zheng's voice crackled over the comms, his tone laced with urgency. General, this maneuver risks escalation beyond our control. I strongly recommend we disengage and reassess. Your recommendation is noted, Commander, Chiang replied curtly, but this is not your decision to make. General, if we fire again, there will be no turning back, Zheng pressed. The Americans are holding their line. We should do the same. Chiang's jaw tightened. Do not contact me again unless I call for you. The line went dead, and Chiang turned back to the tactical display. Prepare the fleet for Phase 2. In the cockpit of her jet, Sarah's radar lit up again. Another PLA jet moved closer, its trajectory aimed directly at her position. "Shadow, they're closing in," Falcon warned. "I see it," Sarah said, her voice even. "Stay sharp. Do not engage unless fired upon." Her comms buzzed with Alex's voice. "Shadow, we've intercepted another message. Looks like Zheng is trying to reel them in, but his influence is waning. If Chiang gives the order—" "I know, Alex," Sarah interrupted. "We're threading a needle here." The PLA jet broke formation, its nose dipping slightly as it made an aggressive approach toward Sarah's wing. For a moment, she thought it might open fire. Instead, it pulled up sharply, releasing flares that lit up the stormy sky like fireworks. "More warnings," Viper said. "This is getting ridiculous." "Stay calm," Sarah replied, though her own nerves were stretched thin. Her comms came alive again, this time with Zheng's voice. "Captain Owens," he said, his tone grave. "I have done everything I can to prevent escalation, but my authority is no longer enough. General Chiang is committed to forcing your withdrawal." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Zheng, we're not retreating. If your forces fire, this will turn into a war neither of us can stop." "I understand," Zheng said quietly, "but I cannot stop it either. I wish you luck, Captain." The comms fell silent, and Sarah felt the full weight of what was coming. In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully sat in the Situation Room, the tension palpable as live updates streamed in. "This is it," he said, his voice heavy. "If they fire another shot, there's no coming back from this." The Joint Chiefs nodded in agreement. "Admiral Hart has been instructed to engage if necessary," one general said, "but the President still hopes for restraint." Tully leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Pray that restraint holds, otherwise we're looking at a global crisis." On board the U.S. destroyer, Admiral Karen Hart gave her orders. "Maintain defensive posture. Do not engage unless directly attacked, but be ready." Her XO nodded. "Missile batteries and countermeasures are hot, ma'am. We'll be ready." Hart stared out at the choppy waters, her face hard as steel. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." The PLA jets moved again, this time with more coordination. They tightened their formation around Sarah's squadron, forcing her pilots into a narrow corridor. "Shadow, they're pushing us," Falcon said. "If we don't break, they'll pin us." Sarah scanned the radar, her mind racing. Every instinct screamed for action, but she held her ground. "Falcon, keep formation. Trust me." The air was thick with anticipation, the silence between the two forces deafening. The next moment would decide the course of history. Suddenly, a new radar contact appeared, a single aircraft entering the airspace at high speed. It was not PLA, nor was it part of Sarah's squadron. "Shadow, unidentified aircraft inbound," Alex's voice crackled. "It's broadcasting an American signature." "Who the hell is that?" Falcon asked. The aircraft broke through the tension like a knife, positioning itself between Sarah's squadron and the PLA jets. A voice came through the comms, calm and commanding. "This is Colonel Ethan Blake, USAF. Stand down, all forces. Immediate orders from Pacific Command." Sarah's eyes widened. "Colonel Blake, what are you doing here?" "Preventing a war," Blake replied. "Shadow, your squadron is to withdraw immediately. PLA forces have been given the same order through back channels. Let's not waste this chance." The PLA jets hesitated, their formation loosening. Sarah exhaled, her grip on the controls relaxing slightly. "Falcon, relay to the squadron. We're pulling back," she said. As her jets turned away, Sarah glanced back at the PLA formation. They too were retreating, their silhouettes fading into the stormy horizon. In Beijing, Major Li Na received the update with a mix of relief and apprehension. The order to disengage had come from the highest levels, a sign that even Beijing recognized the cost of escalation. Back in Guam, Sarah landed her jet with a sense of exhaustion deeper than she had ever known. The crisis had been averted, but the memory of how close they had come lingered. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Falcon approached, his face a mixture of confusion and relief. "Shadow, what just happened?" "Someone blinked," Sarah replied, her voice heavy, "and for once it wasn't us." The horizon was still dark, the storm refusing to fully clear, but for now, the world had stepped back from the brink. Chapter 17: The Aftermath. The airbase in Guam was bathed in the golden light of a setting sun as Captain Sarah Owens stood near the observation deck, her helmet tucked under one arm. Her squadron had returned safely, but the weight of the past 48 hours lingered like a storm cloud refusing to disperse. She stared out at the horizon, the Pacific stretching endlessly before her, a mirror of the fragile calm now holding between two global powers. Falcon joined her, his flight suit still streaked with sweat and grime. "You did it, Shadow," he said quietly. "You kept us steady out there." Sarah shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "No, Falcon, we got lucky. Someone else pulled the strings to keep this from spiraling. That wasn't me." Falcon leaned against the railing, studying her. "Maybe, but you held the line when it mattered. That counts for something." In Guam's operations room, Alex Rivera reviewed the final telemetry from the PLA jets as they retreated back toward their air bases. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but he couldn't shake the lingering tension. "Disengagement confirmed," Mia said, sitting back in her chair. "For now, at least." "For now," Alex echoed, his voice hollow. "This was too close. They pulled back, but they'll regroup. We need to be ready." Mia frowned. "Do you think it'll come to that again?" Alex rubbed his temples. "If we don't figure out a way to shift the dynamic, it's not a question of if, it's when." In Washington, Ambassador Mark Tully addressed the National Security Council, his tone measured but urgent. "This withdrawal buys us time, but it doesn't resolve the underlying tensions. The PLA's maneuvers were calculated. They're probing us, testing the boundaries." President Reed leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "And what do you recommend, Mark?" "Continue showing strength," Tully replied. "But we need to engage diplomatically. Commander Zheng's efforts show there are factions within the PLA who recognize the risks. We can use that." A general across the table grunted. "Diplomacy doesn't work with those who see it as weakness." Tully met his gaze evenly. "Then we make it clear that dialogue isn't weakness. It's strategy. If we don't, the next engagement might not end with a retreat." On board the Chinese destroyer, General Chang Shen received the order to withdraw with stoic acceptance. His officers moved efficiently, coordinating the fleet's return to their original positions, but tension lingered in the air. "General, the Americans' retreat was coordinated through back channels," an officer said. "It seems their high command was just as cautious as ours." "Caution is a temporary state," Chang replied, his voice like iron. "The next test will come soon enough." In Beijing, Major Lina sat alone in her office, staring at the intercepted communications she hadn't forwarded. Her gamble, delaying the satellite jamming operation, had gone unnoticed in the chaos. For now, she was safe. But the weight of her choices remained. A message appeared on her screen, encrypted and urgent. From Commander Zheng Wei, subject, "A momentary respite." "Major Li, your actions were noticed by the right people. Your hesitation likely prevented further escalation. But be cautious. Our system is not forgiving of dissent. Stay vigilant." Lina closed the message and leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. The balance between duty and conscience had never felt more precarious. Back in Guam, Sarah and her squadron gathered in the debriefing room, their faces reflecting the weariness of soldiers who had stared into the abyss and returned. Her commanding officer stood at the head of the table, his tone firm but measured. "Your actions out there prevented an all-out war," he began. "The PLA's retreat was a direct result of your discipline and restraint. That cannot be overstated." Sarah glanced around at her team. Falcon gave her a small nod, and Viper's usual bravado was replaced with quiet respect. They had all felt the gravity of the situation. "But let me be clear," the CO continued. "This isn't over. The PLA tested us, and they'll test us again. When they do, I expect the same composure and professionalism you showed today." As the meeting adjourned, Sarah lingered, her thoughts swirling. Falcon approached, his voice low. "You okay, Shadow?" "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though her tone lacked conviction. "Just processing." Falcon clapped her on the shoulder. "You did good out there. We all know it." That evening, Sarah found herself back on the observation deck, the quiet hum of the airbase a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. She thought of Zheng Wei and the invisible thread of communication that had, for a moment, kept the world from unraveling. She wondered how long that thread could hold. Her comms buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was Alex. "Shadow, just wanted to let you know, we intercepted one final message from Zheng," Alex said. "What did it say?" Sarah asked. "For now, peace," Alex replied. "Short and cryptic, but it feels hopeful." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. For now, she echoed. The night was still, but the undercurrent of tension remained. The world had stepped back from the brink, but the line separating peace from war was thinner than ever.